Hi there, Phil the Practical Gardener again. This particular topic is one of my series that I'm producing on protective structures for growing plants. And I'm going to be looking at this from three different angles. First of all, in which situations you actually need to provide heating for your plants and where you can possibly avoid it. The second aspect I'll look at is the different materials you have on your greenhouses and how you will insulate those structures from the cooling over winter. And thirdly, the different heating systems that you can actually use in your greenhouse. I'll just be looking at them in fairly broad terms. Without more ado, let's get into it. Firstly, I'll discuss the need for heating. Now I've got three different greenhouses here. I've got this covered cropping house that I have for tomatoes and capsicums. So over winter I don't actually crop in there at all. I just leave it bare. It's not actually worth providing heating for tender cropping plants such as tomatoes, beans, capsicums, chilies, or basil, which I also grow in my one. So I just simply leave it bare and then grow a new crop when the season warms up. So effectively it's just got cover crop in there at the moment. Well, I am still cropping a few tomatoes and capsicums, surprisingly enough, a month after the winter solstice. The second house I have here is one that has orchids in it. In this particular house I have cool growing orchids, so they don't actually need heating. Over winter I do actually keep them fairly dry so that they will remain in a reasonably dormant situation until spring, when they will start to grow again. So I don't need to worry about any heating in that house there. The third one that I have here, which is a plastic covered house, I've got my tender orchids growing in and also a few other plants. And I do have a heating system in there, which I'll discuss shortly. So just to finish this particular topic area, you can sometimes avoid plants by simply not growing them during the cold season. Grow plants that actually don't mind getting cool and growing them in an appropriate way through the winter, protected from pests and diseases, and maintaining them in a fairly dormant situation. And finally, providing heating where you really do need to. The second aspect I'm going to look at is the cladding that you have on the greenhouse itself. And it doesn't make as big a difference as you might think. Glass is the Rolls-Royce of greenhouse coverings. Ultraviolet light, visible light, enters a glass house and then warms up surfaces, and they then give off infrared heat, which is maintained within the house. That is, the glass doesn't let it out. So that is quite effective about building up heat. However, glass won't actually retain heat very well over a cold night, and that is because of the transmission of the heat through the glass being a very effective conductor of heat. So therefore what most people do in that situation is they put a second layer, an insulating layer, inside the house. For example, you can get UV protected bubble wrap that you can put inside the greenhouse in winter. Now by doing that you actually provide an insulating layer to the greenhouse, but unfortunately you also reduce transmission of light into the greenhouse because plastic isn't as transmitting of light as glass is. Therefore you do away with some of the benefits that you get from glass itself. However, that is an effective way of actually retaining the heat within the greenhouse. You can also do the same thing with other materials. So for example, this polythene covered house that I have here, you could do the same thing. You could put a polythene liner or bubble wrap plastic inside the polythene house just as you would for a glass house, and that actually is quite effective about retaining heat. Polycarbonate houses have often got a corrugated sheeting over the top, as I've got in this greenhouse there, or you can get the double wall. Now the double wall polycarbonate materials are actually quite effective in insulating, but again they will lose heat over a cold night. No matter what sort of system you have, they will lose heat, but you can do what you can to retain the heat so that when you heat it, you won't actually lose that heat. Finally, I'll look at different heating systems. Generally, it means that you do need to have electrical reticulation into your greenhouse, as I have with this greenhouse here. The exception to this would be a propane burner that you might have in the greenhouse, and these can be thermostatically controlled to set the temperature at the right level. You would have to be careful of those to avoid polluting the plants because they can be very sensitive to some of the gases that are given off through gas burning. You might need to duct that gas off. I don't have a lot of familiarity with that. I've only seen that in commercial units, not actually in a domestic greenhouse. The next way of doing it is through electrical heating. You can just simply set up a simple fan heater, and that is the most expensive form of electrical heating that you can have. A fan heater does have the benefit that it is cheap and simple, and also it does actually provide the air movement that does help to reduce the amount of condensation that settles on plants. So it does actually help circulation of carbon dioxide, which plants need. A more efficient one is to provide a heat pump. And if you install a heat pump, which is more expensive to install, but it is much more efficient, if you had a larger greenhouse or specialist valuable plants, you might wish to put in a heat pump, and I have seen this done. The final way I'll discuss is by putting in heat pads. This is what I've done in this greenhouse here. So I've got a heat pad under my orchid plants, and the heat gently rises up through the plants. I don't actually bother about heating the air. I'm providing the pots that the plants are in and the plants themselves with the warmth. So it is quite an effective system. And I don't actually bother to insulate this house here because the warmth is actually amongst the plants. So the rest of the greenhouse is actually quite cold. So that's the finish of my discussion on this topic. Now this is one of a series that I'm producing on protective cropping. I've looked at the location and orientation of greenhouses, the different materials that you can have on them, and the structures that you might choose to use, looking at them in terms of the strengths and the weaknesses, always from a practical viewpoint. I'll also be discussing cropping within the greenhouse, and then cropping also within the house where you don't actually need a greenhouse at all. And finally, simple close systems that can be a cost-effective way of perhaps starting your crops earlier in spring. Do put comments into the comments section below if you have any questions or comments about heating in protective greenhouses. Also, don't forget to like and subscribe if you haven't done so, and share this with others. And finally, as always, thank you very much for watching this through to the end.